Please welcome the Executive Director of the Energy Future Coalition, Reid, Detchon, and his distinguished panel.
Well, it's pretty hard going after Sally Jewell. That was an impressive speech. I'm Reid Detchon. I'm the Executive Director of the Energy Future Coalition. And like everybody else, I'd like to thank the sponsors and commend particularly Senator Reid for the leadership he's shown on this issue for the past 6 years with these summits. I think you could say that at the beginning of these summits 6 years ago, the phrase new energy future was really a little bit in our imagination still. And the question was, will it happen? Now I think that the technology and the progress that's been made, the new energy future is a matter of how fast will it happen, not will it happen. We have today a great panel, former members of Congress, the Senate and the House. We're trying to address the barriers to federal action. Why has this been so difficult to do? Historically, energy has not been particularly a partisan issue in the usual sense in Congress. It's been more of a regional issue, and largely due to leadership from the western states, the issue has not been particularly polarized until recent years. Each of the three individuals up here not only have been involved in that in a policy way, but I would bring up an old Washington chestnut, which is that there are show horses in Congress and there are workhorses. Each of these three are workhorses, and by that I mean they went to Washington to make things happen and not simply to win elections. And it's been exemplified by their post-election career, their career after Congress. Each of them has stayed engaged on these issues in a deep and personal way, showing their passion, showing their commitment to making this go forward. Senator Dorgan spent 30 years in the House and the Senate, much of it in the Democratic leadership, much of it on the Senate Energy Committee, and in fact was a great partner with Senator Reid, particularly on transmission issues, which we've heard a lot about today. Senator Dorgan, after you left, you joined a group called the Bipartisan Policy Center, which started life as the National Commission on Energy Policy shortly after 9/11. And this was an attempt to bring together people of both parties to find solutions to the gridlock that had afflicted Washington on energy increasingly. And I say the word gridlock because Senator Dorgan is also an author of both fiction and nonfiction, and he has a new eco-thriller out called Gridlock, about the dangers to the system from cybersecurity. I'll let him plug that on his own, but Senator Dorgan, as you look at this congestion in Washington about getting things done, there seems to be some movement on energy efficiency in the Senate in recent days, but over the past 3 years, it's become very difficult to move things forward. Is that starting to shift, and how can bipartisanship play a role here in this topic?
Well, Reid, thank you very much. And I will not shamelessly flack my new book, Gridlock, about cyber terror and Iranian terrorists wanting to shut down the American electric power grid. But
it is available on Amazon.
Thank you very much. And downloadable to Kindle. Let me, first of all, at the Bipartisan Policy Center, former Senator Trent Lott and I co-chaired an energy project that lasted for a year and a half. And we had an advisory group from every point of the compass, energy companies, oil companies, environmental groups, and others, about 20 CEOs around a table, trying to determine how can you find some common ground, rather than just, as is happening in the Congress, you disagree, so therefore you do nothing, and you stop whatever is happening and create this gridlock. how could you find ways to reach some accommodation? And after a year and a half, we put out a product, and it's available to all of you. And I'm kind of proud of the product. I think it would advance our country's energy interests. Congress, as you know, is pretty dysfunctional. If you are serving in Congress these days and you're nourished by accomplishment, you are starving, because not much is happening. On energy, there's some glimmer of hope, I think. You know, the Shaheen-Portman bill, some other things happening, but I still think it's very difficult to get any kind of major energy bill through the Congress. And it's also the case that the world is changing. Go back 6 years to when this conference first started and think of what the issues were then. We're running out of natural gas. We're running out of oil. We've reached Hubbard's peak. It's downward from here. And, you know, lots of issues like that. Well, now we have the biggest oil play on the planet in my state, in the Bakken. And we've got a lot of oil, a lot of natural gas. And some think, okay, that's nirvana, game, set, match. It's done. But it's not done. We need more diversity of resources. We need cleaner energy. We need more renewable energy. We need to make more robust our capability to move energy from one area to another if we're going to really maximize the potential of renewables. So we got a lot of work to do. And, you know, my hope is that Congress will be able finally to believe and understand that the issue of compromise is not a four-letter word. It's the lubrication that allows democracy to work. So I'm starting to see some glimmers of hope, and I hope that will continue.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Wirth, you didn't spend quite as long as Senator Dorgan in the House and Senate, but then you had the experience at the State Department as the Undersecretary for Global Affairs. Tim Wirth, John Podesta, and Boyden Gray, shortly after 9/11, got together, and much as the Bipartisan Policy Center got started with the support from the Hewlett Foundation, the Turner Foundation, and the UN Foundation came together to create the Energy Future Coalition. Again, a bipartisan group looking for common cause at a time when the two parties were relentlessly stuck. As Senator Wirth would say at the time, one of them dead set on Anwar and the other dead set on CAFE, and the two of them couldn't talk the same language. Senator Wirth, you've now had a dozen years of working with that bipartisan group. Is this a successful approach to this issue in Washington?
Well, of course, it has to be. And again, I, like all of us, we want to thank Harry for putting this together and had the privilege of working with Harry over all those years. What many of you don't know is what Byron and I know is that he has a wicked sense of humor as well, and it makes it just so much fun to come out here and think about all those really wonderful times that we have. That's enough. And that is not on Amazon. The urgency of where we are today and the need for the very, very dramatic change, I think, is the other shift that from 5 or 6 years ago is a reality today, and that is the urgency of the climate crisis. We now know more and more and more, and what data comes in is worse and worse and worse. And yet somehow there continues to be this great growing gap between those who understand, read the science, and look at it, and a group of people who are very dominant in the part of the Congress today who deny the reality of this. Now, what do we do about that? That gets us back to your question, Reid. You know, I don't think that this is going to change in the Congress. I don't think it's going to change because you go to a denier and say, look at the data, look at the science, this is overwhelming. You know, and they're not going to say, oh, I wish I'd only known that. If I'd known that, I'd change my vote. They're not going to do that. You know, part of their whole reward system is now all wound up in, you know, where they are and where they're coming from. It's not going to happen. I don't think this is going to happen because we're able to make changes in the Congress for a variety of reasons. The way we're going to get the shifts and changes that are necessary is citizen movements across the country related to women's groups, the health, the Schwarzenegger panel, or Rose's panel this morning, talking with Governor Schwarzenegger and Governor O'Malley, talking about, you know, the impacts of people understanding the health of this, not the science, not the abstraction, but what's it mean to them. The economics. You know, we have to get the economics profession on board and beginning to talk about this in a realistic sense, and not as if we're going to live in the kind of economy with slow but steady growth over a long period of time. We are now going to have major changes. So, you know, I would argue, Reid, that the most important kinds of investments that have to be made, and I would speak this to political people and speak this to foundation people and citizen organizers, is going to be grassroots organization across the United States. Change in the U.S. does not come because Washington says it ought to happen. That was mentioned again this morning. The reality is civil rights didn't happen because members of the Senate Judiciary Committee were sitting high above the Silent City saying we got to make changes. Nor did the environmental movement or the women's movement or the consumer movement or most recently the movement related to the gay and lesbian community. Those did not come from Washington, they came from outside in. That's how change occurs, and we're not going to solve the urgency of the climate energy nexus until we get that kind of commitment, that kind of organization, and that kind of pressure coming from the outside. It's going to take a period of time. We can't kid ourselves that this is going to be easy. It's going to be tough, difficult, some nasty, probably political fights at the state and local level, but I think those are going to be necessary to get us to the point of change that's going to be imperative if, in fact, we're going to have a good energy future and, by the way, save the globe on which we live.
Thank you, Senator Wirth. Congressman Inglis, you had a really unique political career. He was elected 3 times to the House in South Carolina from a conservative district as a conservative Republican. And then, lo and behold, actually obeyed his own pledge on term limits and resigned and didn't run again. Some years later, he went back and competed again, got elected for 3 more terms. And then he had a different kind of an ending that kind of illustrates some of the discussion we've had on bipartisanship here today. Could you reflect a little bit on that theme and on something about what Tim was just saying about how change happens in the system?
Well, yes, I guess I'd say this. You know, I suppose my role here is sort of like the Palestinian businessman in Gaza one time who told me, God gave us 2 eyes, one to see from the perspective of another person, in other words. So I guess I'm the Republican set of eyes here so we can see with both eyes, right? And I think that what I would observe about where we are, and the 2 senators have laid it out well about how there was some agreement and then there wasn't, right? And it's reflected really in the Great Recession, the pain of the Great Recession. And so what I figure came out of that is a distrust of institutions and a distrust of our ability to get together and solve problems. I don't join the chorus that says, well, what we need is this sort of come together and all mush out in the middle and all be moderates. Actually, I think that's precisely what we don't need. What we need is people passionate about solutions and to come forward with their deliverable. The deliverable, I believe, of my party is solutions that actually work because they're based on free enterprise. The deliverable of the other party is basically a sense of egalitarianism and fairness. Now, both are into both of those things. Democrats are into free enterprise and Republicans are into fairness, but those in the main are their main deliverables. So rather than mushing out toward the middle, what we really need to do is come with great passion to say, there is a free enterprise answer to energy and climate. It's a matter of putting all the cost in on all the fuels, eliminating all the subsidies, and then watching the free enterprise system solve this thing without any government regulator driving around in a government tag on their car telling me what to do, but rather me in the liberty of enlightened self-interest, pursuing that self-interest and having a demand-driven change and innovation. But what we got to work through is the pain of the Great Recession. Once we get through that and the easy sort of demonizing it out the side, perhaps we can find that passion and go forward toward a solution.
Well, thank you, Congressman, and let's riff a little bit on solutions and the recession for that matter, because North Dakota never experienced a great recession. They are booming. The oil and gas is flowing. And some people say that that's actually going to be a detriment to a clean energy future. How do you reflect on that and how we move forward with some of these solutions, free market, policy, role in each of them?
Well, look, what is happening in this country with increased production of natural gas and oil is good news. It's transformational news in so many different ways. I mean, we shouldn't regret that's happening. We ought to celebrate that it's happening in our country. But we also know we need diversity of resources. We need a future of lower carbon, and so we know that we need to do much more. One of the areas where I might disagree with Bob a bit, I happen to think that there are things you can do in government that move us in the right direction. I was one of the authors of the Renewable Fuels Standard. I know some think that's controversial, but in a very short period of time, we replaced 10% of our gasoline with ethanol. 10% in a very short period of time. I supported the CAFE standards, federal mandate. Were they the right thing to do? You bet your life. We haven't talked about efficiency here. One of the great strides forward in recent years has been in the area of efficiency. It's been such a great success story. I also support a renewable portfolio or a renewable electricity standard or a clean energy standard. In fact, 30 states have them. We should have one at the federal level. I introduced legislation to do that at 20% nationally. Couldn't get it done. But would it advance this country's interest to have a renewable portfolio standard? You bet your life it would. Now, I'm not suggesting government is always the solution, and the strain of having, and I agree with Tim, that these movements will be best when they spring up from around the country. You'll get a lot done with that, and I also agree that the market system ought to play a role. But I want to make one final point here. The market system with respect to the top line here in fossil energy, oil, is a perversion. There's no free market in oil, never has been. You've got an OPEC cartel. 90% of the oil reserves in the world are owned by countries, not companies. And yet people talk about, the free market in oil. We're producing more oil in this country now, and the gas prices are still high. Why? Because what we pay has nothing to do with what we produce in this country. We're producing more and using less and still paying fairly high prices. It's an international price. And the OPEC countries and others want a certain amount of revenue for the oil they sell. They're going to do what they can to manipulate that price and keep it high. So, you start with all of that and then understand what's the menu of what we need to do. The menu is a lower carbon future. We need to add renewables, add clean energy, build robust transmission that protects our country, and, a whole series of things like that. And there's so much to do. And to finally answer your question, just because we have this great success in oil and gas should not persuade anybody to say, well, that solved that issue. Our energy problems are solved. They are not.
So, Senator Wirth, a robust defense of a strong federal role there. And yet in the electricity sector, it's governed mostly at the state level. Your experience in the House in overseeing the telecommunications shift has some parallels here. How would you look at this?
Well, if you look at what huge transformation we've been through across the country in the last 25 years in telecommunications. If you look back just 25 years, we had an AT&T monopoly and a monopoly of 3 networks. And that essentially ran all of our information. Now, how did that get changed? It got changed on the AT&T side because of a very unique partnership between the Reagan Justice Department and the Democratic Congress. It was a very, very interesting combination, both concerned about how do we go about advancing competition and bringing new starts. There was a lot of new technology out there that was rapping on the door, couldn't get in. It was changing the rules and making it possible for the new players to get in. A similar sort of thing happened with the war against the networks, essentially. I talk about a war against coal, but I mean, it was the networks were doing everything they could to stop cable television. And cable television then came in. That was the beginning of really the arrival of the internet and the enormous changes there. Again, driven by the demand for competition, the demand for bringing new technologies in, and driven by very cooperative partnerships between the administration, the Congress, and the two parties in the Congress. Byron and I were coming over talking about our experiences. My time in the House was, for me, the most satisfying political time because it was so creative and people were determined, you know, to react to what was the possibilities, what could we be doing, and where do we go together. Now, how does that relate to where we are today with in the energy sector? Well, there are some very real parallels. In most states, you have an AT&T equivalent. You know, that's the utility. Now, a lot of these utilities are changing and beginning to understand that if they don't change, you know, their days in the world are not going to be long. You know, they're becoming more focused on distributed power. They're becoming more focused on the possibilities of change related to climate. But they also have to have changes in the rules, just like we changed the rules related to telecommunications. We got to change the rules related to what utilities can do so that they can benefit from these new technologies. They can get rewarded. Their ratepayers can get rewarded. You know, if in fact, you know, they're saving a lot of energy, they ought to be rewarded for saving that watt of energy, just like today they get rewarded for producing that energy. You know, energy efficiency ought to be the first fuel. It is the first fuel. So there are changes that states have to make to facilitate what the utilities can do. And the renewable energy standards, part of that, portfolio standards for that, part of that is important. We have to continue that pressure, and we have to continue to work with the utilities. There are a lot of very enlightened utility presidents, you know, who are really eager for these kinds of changes. They run up against state PUCs. The people who are the lords of yesteryear are lobbying state legislatures to keep the state PUC the way it was, don't make change. You know, we have to get together and allow these changes to be made so the new guys can get in, the new ideas can get in. You know, that's the parallel between, I think, what we did in the telecommunications world was this cooperative venture of government to change the rules so the new guys could get in. We have to do that, I think, at the state level as well, just as aggressively. Maybe it's going to be harder because there are, you know, 50 different polities, and I don't know how many state there are 100 or so when you look at all the utilities that exist. That's a big job, but we got to do it quickly.
Congressman, I would guess that you would have some different views on the role of the federal government from what the two senators have just said. But in your new role as running the Energy and Enterprise Initiative at George Mason, you've been a strong advocate of a revenue-neutral carbon tax, which would certainly be an intervention at the federal level. How do you sort out these issues?
Well, I see a role for the government, and the role for the government is being the cop on the beat that says that we're going to make all fuels fully accountable for all their cost. If you do that, that's a pretty good role for the government. It's a role that we understand because we're used to policing, but not regulating. The regulating part of it is where it gets rather cumbersome. The tax incentivizing part of it gets rather fickle. So if you just put all the cost in, then we get a response, the demand-driven kind of innovation that I was talking about earlier. And I think there's another part here, which is a political piece, is how do you get this done, right? And so, again, a set of Republican eyes here. You know, I think you probably can conclude that Republicans are indispensable partners for action on energy and climate. You could take the opposite conclusion, which is, no, we don't need them. We're going to ram it through. And that's a strategy. It might work. Perhaps you could elect a large enough Democratic majority in the House. It's going to take about 10 years based on redistricting, but you could maybe try to do it that way. Or you could take the more logical, seems to me, strategy, the safer strategy, which is, okay, let's deal with them with respect. I mean, if this is Senator Reid's gathering, largely Democrats, I've got to assume that you would want to approach Republicans with respect and say, okay, you're indispensable partners to action. What does it take to get you involved? And you know, I was in on a meeting one time where Kevin Hassett of AEI, American Enterprise Institute, said something very interesting to a crowd that involved some progressives. He said, you think that climate change is real important? They said, yeah, shook heads in agreement. He said, you think it's existential? Yeah. He says, okay, here's the deal. We'll price carbon through a carbon tax, and I get to pick the corresponding tax cuts. Dollar for dollar, revenue neutral. Deal? And several started going like this. He said, what's the problem? And they said, you choose the corporate income tax to reduce. He said, that's exactly what I'd choose. So it's a real gut check for you, isn't it? Are you willing to let me make that cut? Is climate change really the existential issue that you say it is? If it is, you take that deal. If it's not, then we're stuck. So it seems to me that the thing that I need to, as a set of Republican eyes here to a largely Democratic audience, is help you maybe to see that when Republicans hear the issue of climate change, what they think is they've seen this movie before. The left gins up hysteria. ALAR was going to kill all our kids. Remember the stuff we sprayed on apples? It was going to kill all the kids. Well, then we were going to ban it or whatever. Okay, so you gin up hysteria. You increase the size of the nanny state through regulations and the growth of government and the growth of taxes and reduction in liberty. Well, that causes Republicans to say, well, let's go back and see whether we got a problem or not. Because it's sort of like, if your solution is this big government solution, then I want to go back and dispute whether there's a problem. Maybe like if a surgeon says to me, here's what we're going to do about your neck pain, man. We're going to take your head off. We're going to put it aside. We're going to work on your spine. And we're going to put your head back on. Doc, I think my neck is feeling fine. Thank you. If the solution is something that Republicans can't countenance, which is the increase of the nanny state and growth of government, which is what cap and trade was, then do you treat them as an indispensable partner? If you do, then have respect for them and say, okay, well then let's find something that works for you. And perhaps a revenue neutral, government shrinking carbon tax is that brand new notion that might cause them to say, yeah, that's fresh. And I can see that validates my governing principles of free enterprise and liberty. And it can work with your expressed desire of dealing with climate change.
I'd take that deal tomorrow. And I think it'd be a terrific deal to have. I mean, I'd be all for it.
Senator.
Yeah, this is good.
Senator Dorgan, you have a long track record, despite being in the Democratic Policy Committee and so forth, of working on both sides of the aisle to get things done. Comment either on Congressman Inglis' general prescription for, I would say, listening to each side, or the specific of the carbon tax?
Well, first of all, I support, I believe there needs to be a price on carbon. I don't think there's any question about that. How do you create a price on carbon, a carbon tax, a carbon fee on dividend? Somehow we need to put a price on carbon. But I have difficulties with the nanny state issue because I think, you know, there's a lot that we need to do through government. And we need to do it well and do it right. And with respect to energy, do it now, particularly renewable energy and clean energy. So let me tell you a story. I was on a plane flying to Austin, Texas, and West Virginia was playing football against the University of Texas. And so the plane was full of West Virginians. And the fellow sitting in front of me, who took the seat in front of me, was a very large fellow. He was wearing a T-shirt. It must have been medium at best, because much of him hung out of the T-shirt. And as he turned to sit down, I saw the back of his T-shirt. And it said, "Tell Obama to stop the war on coal." I sat there for a while and thought about that, and I thought, should I just tap him politely and lightly on the shoulder and say to him, you know, friend, I don't think the president has a war on coal. I think natural gas has a war on coal. I'm alive today because I decided not to say a word to him. My point is, however, he cared a lot about coal. So do I. I mean, the fact is, it's one of our most abundant resources, and we need to find ways to be able to use it in a way that protects our airshed. And I believe the issue of innovation and research. I think that's an important part of all that we do. Now, I want to make one other point. We have a utility model in this country, and those utility companies have built transmission, and there's some feeling with distributed generation and the good feeling that comes from that and so on, that we don't need this backbone anymore, this transmission. The fact is, as we've gone to wholesale and retail price competition and electric rates, there is no one collecting that money that is necessary to create a more robust and modern backbone that is less vulnerable to terrorist attack. And believe me, Secretary Panetta, before he retired, said the next Pearl Harbor is likely a terrorist attack. And it's why I wrote this book. The terrorist attack is not just going to be stealing data or trying to spy. It's going to be trying to shut down essential services. And we would be very smart in this country to think through, with this utility model changing, who's going to collect the funding that allows us to have the investment to create this transmission backbone that we need? Pricing, siting, planning, the three impediments to getting any major high voltage transmission lines built across the country. You know, we've built a pitiful amount of mileage of high voltage interstate transmission. We've been building pipeline all over the place, and that's good, but you can't do it with transmission the way it currently exists. I had suggested that we give FERC backstop authority for siting in the 2009 bill that we got through the Energy Committee on a bipartisan vote. Then it got blocked on the floor of the Senate. So there's a lot to do in all of these areas, and especially to think through the big questions. What about the demise of the utility model? We're asking utility companies, and by the way, we have about 3,500 power providers, about 200,000 miles of transmissions. We've got 10 transmission lines, tens of thousands of transformers to step up and step down power. Most of them on average 40 years old. Most of them are made overseas. I mean, we got lots of big issues out there. How do we gather the resources? And if you're a utility company, how do we say to you, you know what we want you to have for your business model? We want you to sell less to your customers. Boy, that's a tough proposition for them as a business matter, isn't it? So we have a lot of big issues to be thinking through, and we need the best of what both political parties can offer, not the worst of each. You know, and we've got some people that view themselves as a set of human brake pads who've decided we just need to stop everything. Just stop everything. Well, they've done a heck of a good job, but it's not in the best interest of this country, in my judgment.
Byron, go for a minute and let's combine the two. Can I just try this? So Bob is saying let's get the price right and have a carbon tax. Let me just say, start with that, right? And don't get it confused with a whole lot of other things. Byron is correctly saying we have a huge investment to be made in research and development. We have a huge investment to be made in upgrading the grid. My view was that when the cap and trade piece, which was an attempt to get the price on carbon to get it right, when that legislation came up, unfortunately, the cap and trade became a cap and tax program. It's what it became, and the money was to go for a whole series of other reasons. So how do you do this, Bob? If we're going to get the price right and do a carbon tax, how do you go about funding the expansion, strengthening, modernization of the grid? How do we do the R&D that has to be done? The related ancillary items that have, for the most part, by the Democratic Party, kind of been tied together with the revenue side. You would not tie, I don't know how would you tie them with the revenue side or do that independently? How would you do that?
Independently for sure, because we've got to reestablish trust among constituencies. I think that this trust is broken. When I go around talking about a revenue neutral carbon tax, the biggest challenge we've got is convincing my fellow conservatives that we will cut taxes dollar for dollar as we put on a carbon tax. Because they really don't believe that government would do that. They believe that government will put a price on carbon, but then won't cut taxes on existing income. And so what we say is, well, it'd be in the same bill or else nobody would vote for it. I mean, no conservative would vote for it if it weren't revenue neutral within the same bill. So I think that it's very important that it be, and in order to establish that trust, we have to take a step that shows you can trust us, that there will be revenue neutrality here. That, in other words, it's a dollar for dollar tax reduction in existing income taxes, or either that or a dividend back of 100% of the revenues to taxpayers through some sort of dividend approach.
So go back to Dorgan's grid and to the R&D needs and so on. How do you get that done?
I think you have to do that separately, and that fits the times, right? Is the sense of the conservatives, especially in the Tea Party, is give us sort of single-purpose bills. What we really don't like is these huge bills that have all these things in them. If we want to do the grid, let's talk the grid. If we want to do carbon capture and sequestration research, which I support, by the way, if I were still in Congress, I'd support. I'm a Republican, not a Libertarian. There used to be a difference. I would support that because there's a role for government there. Because if you don't have a profit opportunity in a near enough term, no profit-making company can say to its shareholders, we're investing in carbon capture and sequestration, because it's not going to produce results. So there's clearly a role for government. But yes, Senator, I'd do that separately so that you reestablish the trust that was broken in the Great Recession.
Can I make the point that I don't think we have an energy plan in this country, honestly. I chaired the appropriations panel that funded all of our energy projects. I mean, I chaired the panel that funded the Department of Energy and the projects. But we do not have an energy plan. We don't have a destination in mind, a goal out there that says, here's where we're headed. Now, there's this old saying, if you don't care where you're going, you're never going to be lost. So we're never lost because we don't have a destination to reach. We should. It would be smart for this country, in my judgment, whether it's at the local, state, or federal level, that we develop some judgments about where do we want to head. Now, we've done that with CAFE. We've done it with a few things. But we really don't, at this point, as a country, have a comprehensive energy policy. And you can't get an energy bill through the Congress. I mean, the only one that might get through, and I'm not certain it would, is Portman-Shaheen. It'll probably get through the Senate. I don't know if it'll get through the House. But you can't get a major energy bill through the Congress at this point. And I think it's sad because I think we need energy legislation passed by the Congress.
But we might be able to get a tax reform bill.
I don't think there's a ghost of a chance for tax reform. And I'll tell you why. I helped write the 1986 Tax Reform Act. I was on the Ways and Means Committee. All the stars lined up. Ronald Reagan was president, Jim Brady, Secretary of the Treasury, Dick Darman, Assistant Secretary, Dan Rostenkowski, strong chairman of the Ways and Means, Gephardt and Bradley introducing legislation, the president introducing. Everybody wanted it, and we reduced the top rate to 28%. I was part of that. I don't think any of those circumstances align themselves today to allow tax reform to happen. I wish I were wrong, but I'm not, I don't think.
So what happens if a lot of conservatives follow the Inglis plan and say we would be willing to go for a carbon tax and tax cuts elsewhere so it's carbon neutral? What kind of a chance do you think that would have, Byron?
Give me a different question. That's a, I don't,
you would say that's the simplest way to do it.
If what Bob is saying is do a price on carbon or a carbon tax and you collect revenue and then say to the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee, here's how much money you have, go to it. My guess is, given the current circumstances in Congress where almost nothing is workable. I mean, they would filibuster, non-controversial bills on tourism. It's unbelievable. So I wish I were more positive about something happening in the short term, but I agree with you. We need tax reform. We need a price on carbon. We need more investment in the grid. We need more investment in innovation in order to make coal more viable, among other things. And we need to celebrate what's happening in oil and gas. All of that is relevant for the country.
I just would add, we focused very much on the federal government and what the federal government can do, and I'm not maybe quite as skeptical, but pretty skeptical that anything's going to happen in Washington now. So I would turn my attention to, one, what the administration can do and what can be done at the state level. If we think about what the administration can do, the implementation of the president's energy plan requires a very dedicated, focused effort in the White House. Those of you who've been involved in government know the interagency process has to be made to work. You've got to pull all of these people together and do it at the highest level. And that does not exist now within this administration. It's very important that we figure out our relationship with China. You know, that drives everything that we do internationally, and we don't have anybody who's responsible day in and day out for that very complicated negotiation with the Chinese. There are a number of things that the administration has to do to get us from here to what the president has decided to be done. And we have to, we have to ask our philanthropic brethren to get serious about developing a much broader grassroots understanding of what the science does. That's where I started. I think that's extraordinarily important. And we have to do what Tom Steyer is doing. He is the #1 funder now of getting a major economic study done on climate change. There hasn't, believe it or not, there has not been a major clear understanding of what the economic options are and aren't for various steps on climate change. There have been a lot of slivers of this, but not the big report. The analog that's used all the time is the Stern report in the UK, where a comprehensive examination was done. So we continue to get the economists fighting like crazy over the fact that any kind of action in climate change is going to destroy the economy and jobs and increase lower back pain and do all of the things that, that any kind of climate action is going to do. So there are a number of things that can and should be done right away, and I hope those don't go unattended, as we hope that also we're going to build a better tomorrow, with a lot of dreams about what a better tomorrow ought to be.
Can I just in 1 minute say I've described the gridlock in Congress, which most of you know, but it is also important to point out that the laboratories of real change are coming at the city level, at the state level, and it's going on all across the country. It's going on here in Las Vegas, going on in Nevada, and in my state and yours. And so there are some hopeful signs that change that isn't happening in the Congress is happening locally. And then one other point that we haven't talked about. The President in his State of the Union address indicated that if Congress is not able to move in certain areas, that he will use administrative authority that he believes he has in the agencies to do so. And you heard the Interior Secretary and the Energy Secretary talk about what they feel they can do. So there is some action in those areas that I think is hopeful.
Let's go back to the state part about it, because I think we heard a lot earlier today about some of the activities of the state and how these technologies and attitudes about energy might scramble the usual political calculations. Congressman, you've probably read about the Green Tea Coalition in Georgia, which is a Tea Party group that is actually suing the Southern Company to be allowed access to solar energy. And we also hear about the evangelicals in their younger ranks having very different ideas about energy and climate. Do you see that kind of thing happening in conservative ranks, rethinking the energy and climate equation?
Yeah, and I'd add a third, and that is some states that used to be coal are now natural gas, are becoming more and more natural gas. And so some Republican House and Senate members need to check in with their states to see whether it's their coal or whether they're natural gas. Or consumers of coal or natural gas. South Carolina, for example, right now, 6 coal-fired plants being converted to natural gas. But yes, on the other two you just mentioned, yes, I see progress on the faith front, people that see this as a matter of stewardship. Rush Limbaugh's comments yesterday, I guess, notwithstanding. I think that Mr. Limbaugh really is probably better at what he does on radio than preaching, and perhaps he might want to leave that question of stewardship to some other folks that have exhibited that sort of faith for a longer period of time. Then on that first one, though, not the faith part, but the Green Tea Coalition is very, very exciting. This is tremendous news out of Georgia. And it's such a great example of using the passion that I was talking about earlier, not trying to tell the Tea Party to mush out toward the middle, but rather to pursue those ideas that they hold so firmly and so rightly to great effect. And what they're saying is, listen, Georgia Power has this thing all set up where you can only buy power from them. And so we had the same thing in South Carolina. We've got the same current problem in South Carolina where you can't have a leasing company come in and put a solar system on your roof, own it, and then lease it to you. Doesn't work in South Carolina. That entity has to comply with all of the Public Utility Commission requirements. Well, there's nobody that's going to do that. So the result is they don't have competition. Well, thank goodness that the Tea Party of Georgia has seen this for what it is, a restraint on trade. And so they, being into liberty and passionate about that, are taking on Georgia Power. It's tremendously exciting. And by the way, in the process, they've apparently offended Americans for Prosperity and the Koch brothers. So what an interesting scenario going on here, where the people who are following rightly their principles with great passion are coming to the right answer, which is, yeah, distributed energy systems make an awful lot of sense, and they actually increase my sense of liberty. And so it fits with what they believe. And so if we could come along and affirm that and say, yes, that's exactly what we want you to do. Now, they don't necessarily want to be told by anybody in Senator Reid's company how to do it, maybe, but they do want to do it on their own. If they do, what an exciting thing.
Senator Wirth, you represented the state of Colorado for 18 years, the classic purple state. You were a great friend of natural gas. You were a great friend of renewables. How do you sort out some of these local politics and whether they're changing right now?
Oh, I'm a great supporter, as Byron noted it. The revolution in shale gas has just been remarkable. And, you know, how we do that, Bob and I might disagree with the setting of standards. I think there are just some very basic standards that have to be set, and the federal government can put together a guideline, let the states carry it out. But I think that has to be done, or the natural gas industry is going to run into, I think, the right to operate, because people are getting very angry about some of the problems related to it, and we're going to screw up this extraordinary opportunity that's been given to us. The more interesting problem is, how does natural gas relate to renewables, and how do we get an alliance going there? That, at a state level, can be done, again, working with the state PUC, you know, to make sure that what happens is that natural gas doesn't drive out the incentives for renewables. We really want to have, therefore, the kind of clean standards that you were mentioning. We have to have, you know, a standard for what do we mean by clean energy, and how do we get from there. So that's what we've done in Colorado. That's been very much part of the continuing discussion with a vibrant natural gas industry and a major renewable energy. A National Renewable Energy Lab is in right outside of Denver, and you know, there's a great combination of the two there. It's a very interesting politics, and potentially a very, very productive kind of alliance to get where I think where we'd like to be.
Senator Dorgan, you get the last word. In North Dakota, you have great renewable resources. You've got great natural gas resources in particular. Right now, there is increasing concern about methane leakage as being a dangerous greenhouse gas contributor. The history and tradition, much as with utilities, has been for regulation at the state level. Is that the right answer, or should there be federal intervention to set uniform standards on methane extraction and how this fits together ultimately, as Senator Wirth was saying, with a larger renewable energy plan?
Well, I think the answer to that will depend on experience going forward. You know, we've been using hydraulic fracturing for 50 years in this country, not on shale, but we've used it substantially, and done properly with proper well boring and so on, done with oversight and proper regulatory authority, it's done safely. And so I support what we're doing in allowing the production of these new discoveries in shale and oil and gas. I think it makes sense for our country and is good news. But as I've said earlier, there's so much more to do, especially in renewable and clean energy, headed towards a lower carbon future. I mean, I really am somebody who believes we should do it all, we should do it right, and we should do it now.
Well, with that, we are 37 seconds away from closure. And I will just say that I think that if we come back for the National Clean Energy Summit 12.0, we will be well into not the future of clean energy, but the present of clean energy. Please join me in thanking this panel.